All things in the universe go through this cycle of myo and ho. Then Renge, I explained a little bit in my lecture, but Renge, it means the lotus flower which grows its seeds and it produces its flower at the same time. So this represents the simultaneity of the law of cause and effect. That you make a cause, and in a flash, the effect is lodged there deep in your life. Sometime it's got to come out. So when the time and the circumstances are ripe, then that effect will appear. And finally, kyo is sound. Sound, because everything in the universe is emitting sound of some sort. Even minute things like atoms and so on are vibrating because they're living things. So everything in the universe is connected by sound. I'm connecting myself to you at this moment by sound. And when you asked the question, you were connecting with me by sound. So sound is of vital importance. This is why we chant Nam-myoho Renge Kyo out loud. Those vibrations going out into the universe and back into us. Kyo can also mean teaching or sutra. So to summarize, we are devoting ourselves to myoho, to this rhythm of life, in both its seen and its unseen states. And at the base of this rhythm or law is that law of cause and effect, which is shaping our future. And this process is going on not only within us, but within everything in the universe. And everything in the universe is connected to us through kyo, sound. What I do or what you do affects everything in the entire universe. Such an amazing thought, isn't it? Just like, as I said earlier, dropping a pebble in a pond and the ripples running outwards. So I think that's the best I can do in a short time. Anyone else like to ask? Yes.
I have kind of a clear question, or really how to put it. You said earlier in your lecture that you realised you were born with a certain amount of good fortune, and by a certain time you felt that something wasn't quite right, it was all going away from you. And I think that most of us have heard of somebody, or maybe know somebody, who from birth, maybe from a very early life, have quite hellish situations, like everything goes wrong, and their life is utter turmoil. And at a certain point, they also find that things, like their lives are turning as well, and things are getting better for them. I mean, are you saying that there's also this misfortune also expires as life goes on, or what?
Oh yes, of course that's true. But the only trouble is that the misfortune, you see, karma arises from our habits and our desires, mostly. Because it arises from these innate desires in our lives, it tends to follow a similar pattern. Because those desires arise from our nature, our character. You can have, for example, an angry person who just has a natural tendency to be an angry person, and perhaps has some desire to dominate people and get their own way. So because that's their nature, they're tending always to create the same sort of karma by making the same sort of causes which have the same sort of effects. So of course the marvelous thing about Buddhism is that it's not saying you can change your nature or character. That would be terrible. On the contrary, in fact, we develop our individuality. But what you do, of course, is that through the practice you transform those negative and destructive aspects of this example, the world of anger, the state of anger. You transform that into something which is creative and positive. So taking that same example, anger can become a driving passion for peace or justice or seeing old people looked after better or whatever. So this is incredible because you suppress nothing in Buddhism. On the contrary, you develop it, but you transform its negative and destructive side into something that is creative and positive. Have I answered your question?
Well, I was thinking, I mean, some people don't actually start the invocation of Nam-myoho-renge-kyo without they start to practice Buddhism. Then, I mean, that's always sort of like, I mean, have they actually changed anything to this suffering that they had before?
Ah, yes. Yes, of course. I mean, you make a cause and it has an effect. And that effect won't appear again once it's appeared. But the trouble is, as I said, that because of your nature, you repeat it, you see. Like that machine with all the dominoes. Okay. Yes.
What would you say the basic differences would be between your chanting and, say, people who practice transcendental meditation, who also would see that their chanting is going to have an influence and ultimately...
Well, I don't know enough about transcendental meditation. I've never done it. But when Nichiren Daishonin declared this teaching, he said that the true religion which is going to give happiness to the people must satisfy three proofs. One was documentary or literary proof in the flow of history. The second was theoretical proof. And the third was actual proof in this lifetime. And he said, though the first two are important, actual proof in this lifetime is most important of all. So I can't answer your question, never having tried transcendental meditation, but I can tell you that I have had actual proof, and plenty of it, and that it has transformed my life. So, of course, for me, that's all I want. Okay, so I'm sorry, I can't, without knowledge of transcendental meditation, I can't really say more. Yes?
Can you tell me what the differences are between the Japanese Buddhism and the old Himalayan one?
When you say the old Himalayan one, I think you mean provisional, what's called provisional Mahayana Buddhism. In other words, the Buddhism that spread north and northeast through China and Korea. Is that right? The Buddhism split into two. It didn't split. It was the way the disciples went after hearing Shakyamuni Buddha teach for a number of years. But Shakyamuni Buddha taught for 50 years, so not everybody stayed with him all that time. And some went southwards to southern India or across to Southeast Asia. And others went northeast through China and eventually to Korea and eventually to Japan. So the southern Buddhism, as it's often called, is known as Theravada. It's also known as Hinayana, but southern Buddhists don't like to be called Hinayana because it means the lesser vehicle. But basically, the southern Buddhism is following the earliest teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha, which he taught in the first 12 years, really, of his teaching life. And it's based mainly on a great many precepts and commandments. In other words, it is instructing people how to heighten their standard of life and way of living. And it involves, because of these precepts, which are also, for those who practice it fully, combined with a lot of aesthetic practices, it's very time-consuming for those who really practice it wholeheartedly. I believe there are something like 250 precepts for men and 500 for women. I don't know why. But because it's so difficult to practice, it really has become the province of monks and priests who carry out this ritual and this practice. And really the people support them. Whereas Mahayana Buddhism, which went northwards, was much more concerned with daily life and much more appropriate to people who were living ordinary lives as ordinary beings. So, for instance, this Buddhism is part of Mahayana Buddhism. So I think when you say Himalayan Buddhism, you're referring to Tibetan Buddhism, which is an offshoot of Mahayana Buddhism. And that follows teachings which were preached by Shakyamuni Buddha much later in his lifetime, and teachings which indeed were much more spiritual, really, much more concerned with the inner man and with the person, as it were, doing it for themselves, rather than through the agency of monks and priests. So Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism, which we practice, follows the ultimate teaching of the Mahayana, the Lotus Sutra, which Shakyamuni Buddha taught 8 years before he died. And then he finally taught the Nirvana Sutra, which is just as he was dying, which is really like an epilogue to the Lotus Sutra, in fact. I'm not sure I've answered your question.
I'm still not sure what's the difference between the Tibetan Buddhism and the Japanese.
It's very difficult to answer. I mean, again, I don't know enough about Tibetan Buddhism. But it's, and also, of course, there are many sects of Buddhism. So the Buddhism that we practice, Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism, is one sort of Buddhism practiced in Japan. Although it may be the one that is growing the most and has a very great following, nevertheless there are other Buddhisms being taught. But by and large, you see, it comes back to this matter of actual proof that we were talking about. Again, in Japan, I think any Japanese person here would agree that most people are not really practicing Buddhism every day. They belong to a particular temple of a particular type of Buddhism, and they will go there when a child's born, or when there's a funeral, or when there's a special festival. Rather like, I think, a lot of people go to church here, don't they? On special days like Easter, and may not go at all in between. Do you see what I mean? So those people are, in a sense, practicing Buddhism rather in the same way as a lot of people nowadays practice Christianity. But of course, because of that, because they're not fully practicing, they can't expect the same benefit. So I think the important point is that Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism gives a practice which can be fitted into one's ordinary daily life. And provided you stick at it, you see the results and get the actual proof. And it doesn't involve sitting on mountain tops, meditating, or removing yourself from this world. Okay. Yes?
In answer to the woman who asked the question, this Buddhism in Japan, women can attain enlightenment, whereas Tibetan Buddhism, women could not attain enlightenment.
Very good. Well done. Very good answer too. Any other questions? Yes.
There are many sects of Christianity, and they all seem to have the crucifix as a common symbol. And to the lay Buddhist, as it were, the only symbol of Buddhism that I'm familiar with is the Buddha. You've not actually mentioned any sort of symbolism for Buddhism, and I can't see any in the whole of the exposition.
No.
Could you
No.
say something?
Yes, that's a very important question, actually, because I think I'd like to begin by saying that Shakyamuni Buddha when he was living 3,000 years ago, predicted what would happen to his teachings in the 2,000 and 3,000 years after he died. And he said that in the second millennium after he died, in many places, Buddhism would become formalized and ritualized, and that people would set up statues to himself and stupas containing his relics. It was an amazing prediction, this. And in fact, he said that that was wrong. But communication being what it is, or what it was in those days, and indeed we've seen it in Christianity and other religions in the West as well, things can get distorted over, 1,000 years unless they're very clearly defined. And this is what happened. So it is not actually, according to Shakyamuni's teachings, that people should worship his statue or idol. And in fact, in Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism, we don't. Our object of devotion is a scroll which is inscribed with many different Chinese characters, 2 Sanskrit characters, but the rest are all Chinese. And down the center is the law of life, Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, which also, of course, represents your life or my life in its highest state, in the Buddha state. And then the other characters all around represent the various forces or influences in life which can act and react either in a positive or in a negative or destructive way. And of course, because Nam-myoho Renge Kyo is in these bold letters down the center, that is inferring, of course, that if you chant Nam-myoho Renge Kyo to this object of devotion, then you bathe everything else on that scroll in the light of Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, in the light of the Buddha state, and therefore it will be turned into something valuable rather than something negative and destructive. So that's our object of devotion. It's mostly actually in Hinayana Buddhism, in Theravada Buddhism, that they worship the statues of the Buddha. Does that answer it? Thank you very much. Anybody else? Great. Thank you very much for those really lovely questions, and thank you very much for coming to our exposition, and thank you very much for listening to the lecture tonight. I hope we'll see you soon. Thanks so much.